Thank you very much. So I'm Karoliina. I'm a chargée de recherche in the MOVE group since 2021, last year. And I will be talking about one of my current favorite research topics, history determinism, which I like to think of as automata that are non-deterministic, but not too non-deterministic. So it's an intermediate model between determinism and non-determinism, the idea being that by looking into such intermediate models, we try to find interesting trade-offs between some of the power of non-determinism and the better algorithmic properties of determinism. So today the idea of this talk is to give you an idea of what history determinism can do, what it looks like, and give you a bit of an overview of the interesting research questions that are going on with this. So I'll take you on a bit of a tour, just for a bit of historical perspective. History determinism was introduced several times independently, once in the context of cost functions, regular cost functions, where there is no such thing as determinization. You can't determinize everything. Therefore, a slightly more powerful model was needed to do what you would do with a deterministic automata. And other than that, it has been mostly studied initially in the omega regular setting, so on finite automata over infinite words. And for the past some number of years, myself and others have started to branch out, looking at what happens if we apply this restricted form of non-determinism to richer models, such as push-down automata, timed register automata, and also in the quantitative setting. So I'll go over a bit about what happens with this model. But first, let me give you a very trivial example of what history determinism is. So here I have some toy automata, and they accept an execution if it has all the transitions of the same color. So it will accept all blue transitions and all black transitions. So here what happens in the initial state, it will either read an A or a B, take either a blue or a black transition. And then in the second state, we have some non-determinism, and we can choose whether to take a black transition or a blue transition. And since our acceptance condition requires us to have true transitions of the same color, we can accept any pair of letters, any two-letter word, by non-deterministically choosing the same colored transition as to match the first transition we have taken. Now the second automaton is very similar, except that here we have our non-deterministic choice is in the initial state, and we have to first guess non-deterministically whether to take a blue or a black transition, and then from the middle state we will take either a blue or a black transition according to the input letter. But again, we can non-deterministically guess whether the second letter will be an A or a B, pick the transition of the matching color, and get an accepting run over all two-letter words. So these two automata recognize the same language, do roughly the same thing, and the only difference between them is that in the second one, our non-determinism has to guess what happens in the future, while in the first one, our non-determinism only depends on the past. So you can probably guess, we say that the first one is history deterministic, the second one is not. And it turns out that this difference is quite important from an algorithmic point of view. Meaning, if all of our non-determinism is of the first type, is history deterministic, then there's a lot of things that we can do with deterministic automata that we can still do, even though we have non-determinism. And so if all of our non-determinism is like that, our automata are broadly very well behaved. And it's only when we start having the second kind of non-determinism that we run into difficulties with more algorithmic complexity. So then the question is, well, how much can we do with such benign non-determinism? How can we use this to make our automata richer and more powerful? Here's a slightly less trivial example. It's an automaton which, over finite words, recognizes the language of words that end in an A, with the last state being an accepting one. If you read it over infinite words, then it accepts the language of words with a finite number of Bs. And how it does it, it has this non-determinism at the start, where it can either stay in the initial state, read A's or B's, and eventually at some point move into an accepting state. And here, intuitively, when do you have to move into the accepting state? At some point after you have read the last B. Now, whether you have read the last B depends on the future rather than the past. So this is an example of a non-history deterministic automaton. Slightly more formally, we say that an automaton is history deterministic if there is a resolver. Now, what we call a resolver is a function which takes the run built so far, so it looks at what has happened up till now. It takes the next letter, and it tells us which transition to take. So it resolves the non-determinism. And this function is a resolver if, for any word that is in the language of the automaton, so for which there is an accepting run, this function will be able to build it. So this is a function that builds executions transition by transition, and it should be able to do so and build an accepting execution run for all words in the language of the automaton. We can also think of a resolver as a winning strategy in the following game, where we have an opponent, who I'll call Adam, who plays letters at every turn, letter by letter from our alphabet. And at every turn, Eve has to respond with a transition over that letter. So Adam gives letters, Eve responds with transitions, and attempts to build an accepting run over the word given by Adam. Adam promises to give a word that is eventually in the language of the automaton. So the winning condition of this game is that Eve wins if either Adam fails to fulfill his promise and plays a word not in the language, in which case Eve wins, or if Adam does build a word in the language, then Eve should have built an accepting run over that word. And here, a winning strategy for Eve in this game is exactly equivalent to a resolver, this function that tells you how to build the accepting word. Okay, so if we go back to our counterexample and try to play this game, well, Adam, he can play an A. Now, Eve, if we are on finite words, Eve has to move to the accepting state, since A is in the language of the automaton, so Eve has to go to an accepting state, from where Adam can play a B followed by an A, thus fulfilling his promise to give a word in the language, and Eve has failed to build an accepting run. So here, Eve has no winning strategy. And that's the same for finite or infinite words. So here's a positive example, this time on pushed-out automaton. Now, if you only want to take away one thing from this talk, this is a good example to focus on, which also means that do ask questions if I'm unclear about what is going on, because I would like everyone to follow to understand this example. So the language we will be recognizing is the following. We see a block of A's of some length, another block of A's of potentially a different length, and then followed by a block of B's. And now the language is the language of such words where the block of B's is shorter than at least one of our A blocks. This is a language that is not recognized by any deterministic push-down automaton. It's not a deterministic context-free language, intuitively because a deterministic push-down automaton has to compare the B's with one of the blocks of A's. There's this non-deterministic choice to be made, and a deterministic push-down automaton can't do it. However, a non-deterministic one can. Here's an example of such an automaton. What it does, it pushes the A's on the stack as it reads them, pushes the second block of A's onto the stack as it reads them, and then it gets to choose what it does. It can either go directly down to P2, where it can read the B block while popping A's off the stack. And then if the number of B's is smaller than the topmost block of A's on the stack, at the last dollar, it gets to transition into an accepting state. So that's one possibility for the automaton when it reads the second dollar. The other one is to first go to P1, in which it will pop off the stack the topmost block of A's, and only then transition into P2, where it again compares the block of B's to what's left on the stack, so our first block of A's. So essentially, it will just decide after reading this, when it reads the second dollar, which block of A's to compare with the block of B's. So it should be fairly clear that it recognizes the right language. And what's nice about this automaton is that it is history deterministic. So it only has one non-deterministic choice to make. And which transition it should pick does not depend at all on the length of the B block that it hasn't read yet, because it can always choose to compare the B block to the longer one of the two A blocks. And that will always work if the word is in the language. So this decision only depends on the history of the word so far. So here we have an example of a language that separates deterministic pushdown automata from history deterministic ones, which are more expressive. Questions about this automaton? Yes?
Is the last dollar very important?
No. I think it's just, I don't think so. I think you could remove it and make that state accepting. So this reference is an MFCS paper from last year. So I've given you an example of what, were there any other questions about the language? Are we good? All right, moving on. A little bit of history about this notion of history determinism. It was introduced once by Hensinger and Peterman in a paper called Solving Games Without Determinization, where they observed that they can use history deterministic automata for solving games without having to go through Safra determinization constructions. It was introduced independently a second time by Thomas Colcombé, as I said, in the context of regular cost functions, which is where the term history determinism comes from. But even before then, it had appeared in some work by Orner, Kufferman, Safra and Vardy, where they were working on tree automata that recognize the derived languages of words. So kind of three very different settings and applications where this notion came up. So it's kind of an argument for it being quite a natural way of restricting non-determinism. This kind of has appeared several times. Now, what is this notion good for, apart from expressing some languages that we can't express with deterministic pushdown automata? Well, one of the traditional applications is the synthesis problem, the reactive synthesis problem, which I like to think of as a game between a system player and an environment player, where the environment will play input letters that to which the system should respond with some output letters, and they interact and build some global behavior. And the goal for the system is to respond in a way that guarantees that whatever the environment does, this global behavior should be in the specification. So we have a winning condition that corresponds to our specification, and a winning strategy for the system corresponds to a controller that allows us to guarantee some nice properties. So, for example, we can imagine that our system is sending us some requests for resources, and the job of the system is to allocate resources in some sort of dynamic scheduling. Dynamic schedule that should satisfy our specification, which can say something about the scheduling being fair or good enough. So how we solve traditionally, how these synthesis games are solved, if we imagine first that we have a regular winning condition. So you have a game and you have a regular winning condition. The traditional thing to do is to find a deterministic automaton that recognizes your winning condition. In the case of regular languages, that is going to be a parity automaton. You use this parity automaton to reduce this original game into a parity game. Essentially taking the product of the original game with your automaton, that will give you a parity game where one player has a winning strategy, if and only if the system has a winning strategy in the original game. So this is the traditional reduction. And then you solve a parity game. So the idea is that you start with a game that has an arbitrary omega regular winning condition, which we don't want to solve directly. We reduce it into solving a game that has a standard winning condition, which we can use algorithms out of the box to solve. Now, what Hensinger and Peterman observed is that in the first step, it is not necessary for this automaton to be deterministic. And in fact, this weaker requirement of it being history deterministic works perfectly well. So we can just substitute a history deterministic automaton and do the same thing without having to go through determinization. So that is one thing that history determinism is good for. And more generally, what this means is that if we want to solve games where the winning condition is given by a history deterministic automaton, then that tends to be no harder than solving similar games with deterministic winning conditions. So in terms of complexity, in the omega regular case, for both Büchi and parity, we would have a next time complexity of solving games of which the winning condition is given by a Büchi automaton or a parity automaton, if it's a non-deterministic one. If we take a history deterministic one, then that complexity goes down to polynomial for Büchi and quasi-polynomial for parity. Beyond the regular world, if we go towards context-free languages, then solving games where the winning condition is context-free, that is in general undecidable. If we take our winning condition to be recognized by a history deterministic pushdown automaton, as the one I showed you earlier, then we get decidability back, and we have an x-time complexity, which is the same as for deterministic pushdown automaton. And this tends to work wherever you have a model where the problem for non-deterministic automata is undecidable or harder, and if it's decidable for the deterministic version with history determinism, you tend to get the complexity of the deterministic one. So, for example, still works for timed automata, for example. There's also a couple of other problems which are also easier for history determinism. So universality, which is just a special case of solving games. Inclusion for history deterministic automata reduces to simulation. And if you like simulation, well, that's tends to be easier than inclusion. So what do we know? So far we've seen that history determinism is good for solving various algorithmic problems. I'm not going to talk about minimization, but it also occasionally has better minimization properties than even deterministic automata. And so that's one side of the coin. That's the part where we try to keep the nice algorithmic properties of determinism. And then the other side of the coin is, well, we have this extra non-determinism, so what are the extra things we can do with this? And that corresponds to things like succinctness, representing properties using a smaller automaton, by using the non-determinism and expressiveness, as we have seen in the case of pushdown automata. So in terms of succinctness, it took a bit of time. So initially, when history deterministic automata were introduced, at first it was conjectured that this type of non-determinism, it just corresponds to deterministic automata to which we have added a bunch of transitions that you don't really need. And at first, all the examples of history determinism were just these automata that are determinizable by pruning, meaning that they contain an equivalent deterministic automaton. So initially, it didn't look like this was a very interesting form of non-determinism. It was just extra transitions. Then it was found that there were some automata that couldn't be pruned into deterministic ones. And then it still took some time to come up for Denis Kuperberg and Michał Szybczak to come up with an example of an automaton that is exponentially more succinct, a history deterministic automaton that is exponentially more succinct than any equivalent deterministic automaton. Now for time, I will not show you this automaton, but it's a very beautiful one. And I strongly recommend, if you're interested, looking at it. It's an ICALP 2015 paper. It's a really lovely example of how history determinism can be very succinct. So instead, I'll just sum up kind of what we know. So on finite words, history determinism is in fact fairly boring, at least for finite automata. Namely, in that case, all history deterministic automata contain an equivalent deterministic automaton. As I said, for the Coe-Buhy case, we get an exponential succinctness gain. For the Buhy case, there's a bit of a gap. So we know that the succinctness gain is at most quadratic, but we have no lower bounds. So it could be that all history deterministic Buhy automata have an equivalent deterministic automaton of the same size, or it might be that there's a quadratic succinctness gain. For pushdown automata, we've seen expressiveness, but we also gain succinctness. And here, so what happens with pushdown automata in general is that non-deterministic pushdown automata, even to recognize deterministic context-free languages, can be arbitrarily more succinct. So general pushdown automata, there is no bound on how much smaller you can make them than any equivalent deterministic automaton. And well, history determinism is somewhere in between an arbitrary bound. So what we have shown is that they are at least one exponential more succinct, even on finite words this time. However, the upper bound could be up to arbitrarily more expressive. So we know that there's a double exponential succinctness gap between non-determinism and history determinism, an exponential one between history determinism and determinism, but at least one of these gaps has to be arbitrarily large. So that's what we know so far. In the case of visibly pushdown, the exponential succinctness gap also works, and this time it is tight. So no exciting gaps to fill there. Okay, so now we've talked about what history determinism is, what algorithmic properties it has, what it can do in terms of expressiveness and succinctness in various automata models. So now let's talk a little bit about how do we know whether an automaton is history deterministic or not. So of course, one motivation for wanting to find that out is, well, we have these nice properties. It would be nice to be able to recognize these automaton. But I'd like to give you an additional kind of orthogonal motivation that goes back to our synthesis problem. So recall this synthesis problem. Now, sometimes this is not quite what we want. So recall that in our original synthesis problem, we require that our system satisfies the specification whatever the environment does. So it's a very strong ask. Now imagine that our system is the canonical safety critical coffee machine. And well, the specification is it should make coffee when you ask it for coffee. But now imagine we have an environment that refuses to fill in the water tank when it is empty. So you have grumpy users wanting coffee but being too lazy to fill in the water tank, and now your system can't possibly give you coffee. Now if we go by the traditional definition of the church synthesis problem, Church would say, well, this is unrealizable, there is no coffee machine, it can't be done, let's all go home. Now, potentially, one could say, well, it's not really all that bad. We could potentially have a coffee machine that, in this case, doesn't produce coffee, and maybe that's okay. And this is, so for this, we need to relax our synthesis problem and say, our system just needs to fulfill the specification as long as the environment is being reasonable. And that's what Almagor and Kupferman call the good enough synthesis problem, which captures exactly this relaxed form of reactive synthesis. Now it happens that this good enough synthesis problem, if you given a deterministic specification, is exactly equivalent with a polynomial reduction to deciding whether a non-deterministic automaton of the same type is history deterministic. So there's a kind of interesting motivation to decide history determinism, namely it also solves this particular synthesis problem on the way. So what do we know about that? Well, in the omega regular setting, for both Büchi and co-Büchi automata, we have a polynomial time algorithm. However, once we go towards more difficult acceptance conditions, so in the case of parity for a fixed number of priorities, it is open whether it can be done in polynomial time. There's a conjecture that yes, it can be done, that the same algorithm should work, but we don't know how to prove that the same algorithm works. In the case of context-free languages, it becomes undecidable, but we get decidability back with visibly pushdown automaton. And now I've talked about kind of this part of the map. And just for the last part of the talk, we'll cross the ocean and see what happens when we talk about the quantitative setting and quantitative automata. So here, what I mean by quantitative automata, they're similar to the previous automata, except this time transitions carry weights. So now a run is going to be a sequence of transitions, and it induces a sequence of weights that is either finite or infinite, depending on whether we are on finite or infinite words. We then have some payoff function, which takes this sequence of weights and aggregates it into a payoff of the run, a value of the run. And so this can be the inf, the sum, the suc, the lim, the average, whatever you want. Which takes our run and gives us a single value. And then as our automaton is non-deterministic, we might have several possible runs on the same word. And in this case, we take the supremum over the values of the runs. So in this example, what do we have? We have an initial state that reads A's and B's. We have a non-deterministic choice to eventually go into the middle, where we read A's with weight 1 until the next B, when we stop reading weights. If we interpret this as a sum automaton, every execution counts the length of some A block. So if we take the supremum over all of the executions, what this automaton does, it counts the length of the longest A block in our word. So that's the type of creatures we'll be working with. And we can generalize our definition of history determinism very naturally to this quantitative setting. So we again require for them there to be a resolver, which this time, instead of inducing an accepting run, should induce a run that has the value of the word. As before, there is a resolver corresponds to a winning strategy in this game where Adam plays letters, Eve responds with transitions, and this time Eve has to build a run that is optimal, that captures the value of the word from the automaton. Now, going back to our history and nomenclature, so recall that history determinism was introduced several times under different names. And that was kind of fine, because it turns out in the omega regular setting, all of these different definitions that were introduced, they all coincide. So they had slightly different definitions, and they were all the same. So one of the definitions was based on being good for games, in the sense that this composition with games reduction works as expected, and that's what was called good for games. Then we had this definition with the resolver, and in the regular setting, exactly the history deterministic automata, so the automata with resolvers, they are exactly the same as the ones that compose with games. So this wasn't really an issue at all, and everything was fine. However, it turns out that when you look at quantitative automata, these two notions do no longer coincide. And that's why, if you look at the literature on history deterministic automata, there are a lot of papers call them good for games, and then recently we've started being more careful and using the term history determinism when we mean history determinism. So yeah, that's just a little aside about why I used to give this talk, and it used to be about good for games automata, and now it is no longer the case. And the example that I will not go over in detail is extremely simple. It just needs 3 values to work. It works with any payoff function and shows that these notions do not coincide in the quantitative setting. Anyway, end of little bracket about nomenclature. As in the non-quantitative setting, in the quantitative setting we can also relate history determinism with the reactive synthesis problem. This time, still we have our system interacting with the environment, but this time, instead of trying to fulfill a specification, our system tries to somehow optimize the behavior. Now, there are different ways one can think about optimizing behavior. The first one is to optimize the worst case behavior. So I have a strategy, I look at what's the worst possible thing the environment can do in response to my strategy and say, that's the value I want to make as high as possible. Now again, that's not necessarily the only thing we would like, because in particular, if I have a strategy where in some case I get a very poor value, then there is no motivation for my system to do anything better any of the other times. So if my environment could cause me a bad outcome, then my system can just give me a bad outcome all the time and say, well, I can't do any better. Well, we would possibly want the system to optimize slightly more locally, so which is what we call the best value synthesis problem, where we ask that the system, for every input sequence that the environment plays, responds with something that is optimal. So gives an outcome that has the best possible value for that input. And as in the omega regular setting, this best value synthesis problem is polynomially equivalent to deciding whether a non-deterministic quantitative automaton this time is history deterministic. And so what's nice about this equivalence is that, well, there's been a lot of work that has been put into trying to decide or understand how to decide history determinism in the omega regular setting. We have these nice polynomial time algorithms for the Büchi and co-Büchi case. And now looking at this equivalence, we can try to take those nice techniques we have in the omega regular setting and extend those in the quantitative setting in order to solve both of these, both the best value synthesis problem and the deciding history determinism. So that's what I've been working on recently. So I'll just give, for the last couple of minutes, a slight little bit of insight into what kind of techniques we use to decide history determinism. So the difficulty of doing this, recall, is that we're trying to solve this game where Adam plays letters, Eve responds with transitions, and the winning condition compares Eve's run to the value of the automaton. But the value of the automaton, we don't have access to it. So it's not clear how to solve these games with this strange winning condition. Of course, if we had an equivalent deterministic automaton, then we could, at the same time as Eve build her run, we could build a deterministic run and then maybe try to compare those. However, we can't always determinize quantitative automata, and even if we can, it's a complex procedure. So that's the kind of difficulty we need to get around when we try to decide history determinism. So then we can ask, what would Marc Bagnol and Denis Kuperberg do? They came up with the algorithms in the omega regular setting. And what their approach was, well, we're not going to play that game. We're going to play a different game and hope that it has the same winner, essentially. Or show that it has the same winner, more precisely. And the games they play are like this. Again, Adam plays letters, Eve responds with transitions, tries to build a good run. But this time, Adam, after Eve has played a transition, also has to play some transitions. So Adam now has some k number of tokens that he has to also use to build k runs over the same word. And this time, Eve doesn't have to match the actual value of the word, it just has to do as well as any of Adam's runs. And why these games are potentially interesting is that now we have some concrete runs to compare Eve's run to, rather than this abstract value. So then, if we want to decide history determinism for a class of automata C, one way of doing that is to show that this game, for some number of tokens, namely 1 or 2, has the same winner as this letter game where Eve has to just build the best run. And the idea is that Adam, by playing these runs, gives Eve some extra information, but because he's playing several tokens, maybe that information doesn't actually help Eve. So if we can show that these games are equivalent, then, and if we can show that we can solve the token game with either 1 or 2 tokens for this class of automata, well, then we have an algorithm to decide history determinism. And this was a strategy that worked in the omega regular setting for Buffy and co-Buffy automata using the 2-token version of this game. So now with Udi Boker, we took this idea and applied it to quantitative automata, and in particular to lim-sup and lim-inf automata, and obtained the following result. Deciding history determinism of lim-sup automata can be done in quasi-polynomial time, and for lim-inf automata it can be done in exponential time. And we use exactly the proof sketch before. The difference in complexity comes from the fact that solving the 2-token game for lim-inf automata is slightly more complicated than for lim-sup automata. We also showed that the 1-token game characterizes history determinism for all quantitative automata over finite words, and on discounted sum automata over finite or infinite words, again giving us algorithms to solve those in polynomial time and in NP intersect co-NP, respectively. So I'm going to conclude there. So what we've seen is that sometimes you don't need very much non-determinism to do some interesting things. So gain expressiveness, gain succinctness, as long as you are slightly careful with what kind of non-determinism you are using. I did not mention a couple of dimensions of history determinism, namely recently in some work with Antonio Cáceres and Thomas Colcombe, we showed that there's a relation between the amount of memory you need to solve Muller games that is exactly the size of minimal history deterministic automata. And there's also a line of work on minimizing history deterministic automata that kind of suggests, both of these results kind of suggest that there's something quite fundamental and interesting in the kind of canonical about history deterministic automata, but I won't go into that. And just to conclude on some of my favorite open problems about this is, well, I mentioned the problem of can we recognize history determinism in polynomial time for parity automata with a fixed number of priorities. We know how to do it for Buhi, we know how to do it for co-Buhi. We believe that the same algorithm should work for parity, namely the two-token game, solving the two-token game. But that is very resistant to being proved. And what's quite interesting about that problem is that usually once you know what to do with Buhi and what you do with co-Buhi, you kind of combine them to solve parity. In this case, that doesn't seem to work. The foray into quantitative automata has opened up a bunch of directions, namely once we work with quantitative automata, we can work with approximations and thresholds. So there's quite a lot of things to do there. And I mentioned, of course, these succinctness gaps, the quadratic one for Buhi, or the unbounded one for pushdown. So there's still a lot of things we don't understand about these automata. I'll end there. Thank you very much for your attention. And I can take questions in the language of your choice. If it's English or French, I'll be able to answer. Finnish will work too.
Are there any questions?
The notion of history determinism applies to other. I'm sorry, I'm not sure my question completely makes sense. But does it make it apply to other objects rather than automata? For example, there are connections between automata and grammars. Can we talk about history determinism of the grammars, or just this idea of being somewhere between determinism and non-determinism? Maybe this kind of concept and history determinism may apply to other objects rather than automata.
So for grammars, I think we tried to think about what that would mean and kind of failed, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a reasonable notion to be found. It just means that we don't use grammar. Our particular intuition about grammars is not good enough to do that. But I agree that that's a very reasonable question to ask. We've also toyed with ideas of history deterministic transducers, history deterministic Turing machines, but again, it hasn't, the kind of killer application has not emerged. So yeah, those are like very reasonable ideas to toy with, and I'm sure some of them do make sense. Yeah, so far I haven't been convinced by any of them, but yeah, it's all fairly young, so I wouldn't be surprised if there was something interesting there.
Yeah, maybe also my question, I'm not sure that it makes sense, but I try. I can associate to an LTL formula, Buchi automata, but I can't remember now whether the association go through a non-deterministic Buchi and then it is transformed. I don't remember. But the question is similar. What would make what would correspond in terms of LTL to a history deterministic automata?
Yeah, so that's a very nice question. So LTL formulas, or formulas in general, you have disjunctions that correspond to non-determinism, conjunctions that correspond to universality. Yeah. So a formula is very much like an alternating automaton. Yeah. So we did some work on history determinism in alternating automata, where the definitions do work out very nicely. So that is one thing you can apply directly to formulas, is to say it's history deterministic if the corresponding alternating automaton is history deterministic. Now, alternating automata are somewhat niche, as in sometimes I feel like I'm not the only one who loves them. So then the kind of one of the problems that would be very nice if we could solve is what is a fragment of LTL? What are the LTL formulas that we can turn into history deterministic Brüchi automata or parity automata even? But that seems to be quite tricky because essentially removing the conjunctions, that creates more non-determinism, and well, that is not clear. So there's been some attempt about some fragments of LTL that are somehow, I think they're called, is it eventually safe deterministic or eventually deterministic or something like that, which kind of gives a partial answer, but. Yeah.
Thank you. And we can thank again Karoliina.